I'm delighted to welcome back our one-time chairman of the museum, Dr. Eric Grant. Uh, Last time he was talking about things at Tarradale a lot longer ago, but I know he's been digging into the later history for many years. So Eric is an archaeologist and historical geographer who stayed at Tarradale House in the 1960s when it was a field centre for the University of Aberdeen. The big sign for which is still up by the road, isn't it?
Yep.
Very useful. Um, Eric and his wife Judith purchased the house in 2003 directly from the university. I've often wondered that.
Yes.
Yes, and for the last 20 years, Eric has been researching the history and archaeology of Tarradale House and the surrounding area. So I think well, I know we're in for a fascinating talk because I've heard of some bits of this in the past, and yes, you might be surprised at just how fascinating it all is. Um, we'll have a Q&A at the end. If you'd like, please to post any questions in the chat facility, which you'll find down at the bottom. I will pick those up at the end and put them to Eric. And so, without more ado, I'll hand over to him, I think.
Okay. Thank you, Alistair. Thank you, folks, for coming to listen to me. I will warn you, there is a lot of slides with data on them, and I've highlighted in red the main bits. So I'll tell you when you come to them. But we'll start off with Tarradale House. This is what it looks like today, but this is the outcome of a rather long and complex history. And most of what you see today is fairly recent. But I will be able to show you later in the talk that there are some old bits hidden inside this house. So where is Tarradale House? If you don't know where it is, you've not been there, this is the road from Tor to Muiravoord. There's Muiravoord, here's the main road. Here are the famous Tarradale bends on the main road, and just down there is Tarradale House. Now it says field centre on the ordnance map. It used to be a field centre, as Alistair said, belonged to University of Aberdeen, but I bought it, my late wife and I bought it from the university in 2003. So this is what it looks like from the air. So it's an ancient landscape of settlement. There's Tarradale House down there with its wooded policies around it. This is the Bewley Firth. So this is looking northwest. There's Muiravoord village in the background, and there's Ben Wyvis in the far background. But what this picture shows is this wonderful area of fertile farmland, light, easily cultivated soils, the glacial outwash and terraces. So they have been cultivated for thousands of years over the sea. And there's a contrast between that and the green area behind, which was covered in boulder clay, much heavier to operate, but still presented a whole range of resources to the incomers, first incomers. The Tarradale estate, which is the real focus of my talk, goes up this line here, across here, down the edge of Muiravoord and back along here. So this whole area you see is really the Tarradale estate, 2,000 acres in its prime. I'm afraid I only own 7 acres down there. But as I said, a landscape of ancient settlement, and we had some excavations over the last 7 years, and we find these wonderful artifacts, only 70 or 80 meters from the house, just in the field next door, where some Mesolithic people had camped on the shore of the Bewley Firth all this time ago, leaving behind these wonderful artifacts, which are now really quite well known and quite famous. Part of an axe there, and part of a broken part of a harpoon. So, I mean, these are very rare items. We actually have found 3 of these axes, and that's the same number as they'd found in the whole of Scotland beforehand. And also a bit later on, excavations showed again there'd been a lot of settlement in the area. This is a barrow cemetery, graves. And those of you Grom House know all about the Picts will recognize classic square Pictish barrows there, as well as round barrows. But they date from the Bronze Age. There are almost certainly 2 big Bronze Age barrows in there, another one in here. Then this is an Iron Age barrow cemetery, and then a Pictish barrow cemetery there and there. That's the largest square barrow cemetery in Scotland. So clearly whoever lived here or died here was of great importance in Pictish society. So we've got a background of fertile land, sought after land, people living there continuously right through. So if we jump in time from the Picts, as it were, to medieval period, The first mention of the name Tarradale or Tarradale was in 1225 when the church was mentioned in relation to a charter. Now, Tarradale Church, which is also called Gilchrist or Kilchrist Church today, has been rebuilt. I mean, that's no longer a church, it's a mausoleum, but that essentially is probably the medieval footprint of the church. So that's our first documentary reference, 1225. Time team watchers may recognize Mick Aston there, my great friend. We were at university together. Okay, now look at other reference. I said the red are the bits to sort of latch on to. So 1225, Tarradale Church mentioned. Then we get the Gilchrist of Ross giving a piece of land to Bewley Priory. Then we've got a chaplain rector. The important thing is down here is this one, 1278, Colin Gove, Constable of Tarradale, witnesses a charter. If you've got a constable, you have a castle. So a constable is a person who is in charge of the castle. And that, you know, that is a very important thing because there's no proof of the existence of a castle there until this documentary reference, because we're still not 100% sure exactly where the castle was. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it was clearly an important castle because the next one, 1304, the Earl of Athen petitions the king, Edward I, not to give a Boyne castle to Alexander Cummin, as he already has Urquhart Castle and Tarradale, two of the strongest in the country. Well, to put Tarradale in the same sentence as Urquhart Castle, you know, that huge monument on the shores of Loch Ness, you know, it tells you something. There may have been a hype, I don't deny that, but clearly it was a place of some importance. And Edward I, you know, he was the one in the Wars of Independence who was trying to secure Scotland for himself or his chosen friends. So the Earl of Atholl saying, don't give a Boyne to the Commons, they have enough castles as it is. 1308, the Sheriff of Banff informs King Edward II by now that Robert Bruce has destroyed Tarradale Castle. It's all part of the Wars of Independence. So that's the documentary evidence. So if we start looking at archaeological evidence for a castle, this is the kind of thing we find, well, sometimes we find this when field walking. These pieces of medieval pottery, these are 13th, 14th century glazed pots. These two here are probably locally made redwares. This is probably from Yorkshire, Scarborough area perhaps. But these are fine pieces. We don't normally find them looking quite as nice as that. This is more often what we find when we walk in the fields looking for bits and pieces. So we've plenty of medieval pottery. And when we plot that on a map, we see two areas of density. So the K is for Kilchrist. That's the church I showed you the photograph earlier. So we've got dense pottery, high levels of pottery in the fields there. And T is for Tarradale House, and high levels of pottery, but a very high level just to the south of Tarradale House. So, you know, either of these could have been the centre of the castle, but we're pretty sure it was where Tarradale House is today. But as I said, there's nothing physically remains in the landscape. But we're pretty sure it was here. There's Tarradale House ghosting through the trees. This bank, this mound, is a natural feature. That is a raised bank between two former sea levels. So the sea was once up here, a long time ago, and then it dropped down to here. And this is the cliff, the sandy cliff that developed between the two levels. So that's a ready-made sort of motte, if you want, a castle site. So we're pretty sure the castle was probably somewhere on top of that. If we look at again, Airlily, that's the bit we're talking about. There's Tarradale House just behind. So I said this bank is part of an old shoreline running through here. And to help this argument is the finds of silver pennies of Edward I. We can construe that there was quite a lot of English troops or people in with the English king at this time by the number of silver pennies, but they're heavily concentrated around Tarradale House. So again, it's evidence that somehow somewhere the castle was in there. And we also found this little item, if I blow it up a bit, it's only a few centimeters long. It's a heraldic pendant from that part of a horse. So when knights went cantering along, these things, which are usually gilded, as this once was, would glisten in the sun and make quite a show. But what's interesting with this little pendant, which we found right on the site of the supposed site of the castle, is that this is heraldry. This tells a story, and we can actually work out it actually belongs to the de Verdon family. And Theobald de Verdon was summoned to the Northern Wars, i.e. the Wars of Independence, by Edward II. So we know that Theobald of Arden and possibly some of his mates were in Scotland during the Wars of Independence. So there's a very good chance he was visiting or stationed at Tarradale Castle, and perhaps in leaving in a hurry, he lost a bit of his horse harness. Well, again, as I said, we still don't really know what Tarradale Castle looked like. I mean, this is a motte and bailey, a little model here. You can see the motte with a wooden tower on the top, and then down below the enclosure, the bailey, where all the everyday things, the cooking and animals are kept and so forth. So one would expect Tarradale was a bit like that, but that's as much as we can say. So back to our quotation here, our documentary reference of Duncan, the Sheriff of Banff, telling Edward II that Robert Bruce has destroyed Tarradale Castle. The evidence for this is this charter, which is now in the Public Record Office, or perhaps been in the Public Record Office a long time, but was lost. It was only recovered about 50 years ago. It had been screwed up and stuck behind some other charters on a shelf, and the mice had been at it, as you can see. But an archivist managed to interpret this whole thing, which is a letter, as I said, from the Sheriff of Banff to the king, telling him the nasty things that Robert the Bruce was doing in Scotland. And here is the bit. So it was transcribed by Patricia Barnes, an assistant keeper in the Public Record Office, published in the Scottish Historical Review 50 years ago. She just expected everyone, of course, could read Latin. So there's no translation given with it. You know, historians were looking at this type of document, expected to be able to read Latin, but it's actually fairly straightforward Latin, even though part of it's now lost behind the icons, but I know what it says. So if you look up here, Daindy versus Castellum de Mortlach, Satra and Stulit, then they went to, moved themselves to the castle of Mortlach. Now, Mortlach is Dufton or Balvenie Castle. And the castle there and the land there belonged to Lord Reginald of Cheam, but it was destroyed with flames being thrown into the middle of it. So they destroyed Balvenie Castle. Then towards the castle of Tarradale they moved. The land, surrounding land that belonged to Lord Alexander Comyn was destroyed. The Earl of Ross, ab ipso se retraxit. The polite translation of that is, did a runner. He took himself away because he had backed the Commons and he suddenly realized he'd backed the wrong side. So the Earl of Ross got him se retraxit, took himself away pretty sharp. So there's the evidence of the castle and the capture of the castle by Bruce, who burnt it and burnt the surrounding countryside. So he did a pretty comprehensive job. So here's Bruce in all his glory at Bannockburn. So he won the Battle of Tarradale, 1308. But what happens next? That's the question, because there's no evidence that the castle was ever rebuilt. What happened to the site and the castle? Well, we're back to the documents, I'm afraid. In 1309, Bruce gave Tarradale to the Earl of Ross. So the Earl of Ross had come back into favour. As I said, he had backed the Commons the wrong side, but he realised that Bruce was the right side, so he made his peace and was rewarded by being given the estate of Tarradale. But it does not appear as if he rebuilt or used the castle. He, as Earl of Ross, had a castle in Dingwall, of course. I mean, sometimes they had plenty of castles, but he didn't seem to be at all interested in Tarradale Castle. And the earldom with the castle passes through various people, and sometimes back to the king. So in 1430, King James I, as Earl of Ross, one of his titles, gave the Thane of Cawdor the right to hold 3 courts annually at Tarradale. Well, this is a big mystery to me. I don't really know what this means. Why is the Thane of Cawdor having a right of court? And did he exercise this right? Did 3 times a year people turn up to sort out legal problems? It's an intriguing question. And then down here, James VI grants the earldom of Ross, which by then was part of the barony of Delny. He granted to Sir William Keith in 1587. But a few years later, William Keith resigned the barony in favour of Kenneth Mackenzie of Kintail. So this is a very important event. This is introducing the Mackenzies into the story of Tarradale. The Mackenzies came from the west side of Russia, but at this time, 16th and 17th centuries, they've spread their power eastwards until they occupied nearly all the main sites in Russia. Getting back to the castle, as I said, we still don't really know, where it was exactly, though good idea. Now, This is a magnetometry survey where they use a machine to test the magnetic response of the soil. This white bit is the steep bank of the castle. So this is the bit above, the flat bit above, and this is the bit below. And with a bit of eye of faith, you can start seeing patterns in there, a circular feature there, a linear feature there. So if you color these up, we thought, aha, this looks like a motte with a ditch around it, and then down below the steep bank, an annex, a bailey. So that seemed very promising. So in 2017, we excavated the site. Unfortunately, we didn't find a castle. These layers of stones turned out to be natural. They've been redeposited in a stream bed. There were no artifacts on the site. And, you know, if you're on a castle site, you will find pottery, you will find coins. So we had to say there's some, well, when I say it's not the site of the castle, this is not the floor of the castle. My view is still that the castle was on the site, because remember, we found the heraldic pendant there. But the castle was, or the site of the castle, which was mainly earthen mounds, I should think, was completely flattened. The soil moved probably westwards to grade the grounds to make nice flat front lawn for Tarradale House later on. So I think, you know, unfortunately today there was nothing to see of the castle. But there was certainly something there in the 16th century, because Timothy Pont, who was the man who made the first manuscript maps of Scotland, and he made his maps by walking through the counties of Scotland, recording in his notebook various places and the distance between them. Unfortunately, the map of Russia doesn't survive. It's the only one that doesn't survive, or this part of Russia, but his notebook does. So he says here, half a mile from the castle of Redcastle, which is down in the bottom right-hand corner here, half a mile from that is Killernan Church, is still there, medieval church. And then 2 miles thence is Tarradale, with the old castle of Tarradale. And a mile thence is Gilchrist, the church, that church I showed you earlier. Now, these distances work exactly. So he is saying there was the old castle of Tarradale. There was something to see in 1590. As I said, we don't know what, but I suspect there were still earthworks then, which have now totally disappeared. So back to the documents in the 16th century. And this is slightly complex, but the king in 1526 granted to Walter Innes the mill of Tarradale with its lands, crofts, and houses. No mention of a Tarradale house, a castle, but the mill of Tarradale. And then sometime later, 1587, this grant to William Keith, Tarradale with its alehouse, the mill of Tarradale. So Tarradale, the alehouse, and the mill. So we've got 3 items being listed here. So this to me suggests something has happened. Tarradale's become important. It's more than just a mill, it's an alehouse, but also a place in its own right. And in 1595, this is where the Mackenzies come into the story, the king granted the lands of Tarradale, so the lands of Tarradale with the mill and the brew house or the alehouse. So clearly by the end of the 16th century, I think one could say there's something there. There's a house. People are living there, along with the mill and the brew house. And again, 1608, Tarradale and the mill. So we know, as I said, he was granted William Keith Tarradale with his alehouse, and so forth. So what's very interesting, as I said, what we see here is largely Victorian, but buried in a wall in the house, deep in the wall there, is part of a lintel. Unfortunately, it's only half a lintel, and it has 86 on it, but it's clearly a date stone of some sort. So was it 1586 or 1686 or whatever? Well, looking at the way the letters are written, I would guess this is 1586. So I think there's a clear suggestion that just at this time, Tarradale was rebuilt or reappeared as a building. So that's my best guess. So I think by the end of the 16th century, we have a building there, a house. It's not called a castle anymore, but some kind of manor house mansion that was controlling the whole of the Tarradale estate. But as I said, it was the Mackenzies who came in at the end of the 16th century. They were given the Tarradale by the king, Kenneth Mackenzie of Kintail. And eventually, as I said, the Mackenzies spread all the way through Russia and other Mackenzies, and they all married each other anyway. So we've got the Mackenzies well established by the beginning of the 17th century. We've got John Mackenzie in 1663, and his daughter Catherine married Simon Mackenzie of Torridon and Lentrin, which brings Lentrin into the story. And then further down the line, Alexander Mackenzie of Lentrin, Tarradale, and Rhinedown. So we're finding these three estates linked by 1740. Lentrin is immediately across the firth from Tarradale, just on the south side of the Beaulieu Firth. Rhinedown is just on the hill between Muiravoord and Beaulieu. So they're all local estates. They were in the hand of this chap, Alexander Mackenzie. He had three sons to leave this to. The first one would have been there, except he died young. Second son, Roderick, went off to America and was never heard of again and presumed dead. So he didn't inherit. So the person that did inherit the estate was John Mackenzie of the Temple. And he's called of the Temple because he was a barrister in the Temple in London. So that's him. So he has an important part in the story. So here's John Mackenzie, telling us he's a barrister, admitted first to the Middle Temple. 10 years before he was called to the bar. That suggests he wasn't awfully good, really. Then he was admitted to the Inner Temple in 1784. But what we're really concerned about is his other tasks. He was secretary of the British Fisheries Society and secretary of the Highland Society of London. Now, the British Fisheries Society was a big thing. It was they who built Ullapool as a fishing port and Wick and other places. So he was secretary of that. That was quite a big thing to be involved in. But also secretary of the Highland Society of London. The Highland Society was an attempt in London to keep Highland culture alive, with all the repression after Culloden, and that, people were trying to get all the Highland and Gaelic culture out of them. But they were trying to preserve it, these Scotsmen who had moved to London on the make, as it were, but they tried to keep Highland culture going. So Mackenzie was secretary of that. And one of the things the Highland Society did was to encourage this person here, James Macpherson, thank you, here we are, who produced two books or several volumes called The Works of Ossian, the Son of Fingal. Now, these suddenly appeared on the scene in 1765, saying that, and Mackenzie said that he had found some ancient Gaelic manuscripts written by Ossian, son of Fingal. Now, of course, we don't know if Ossian ever existed, so just a name, a mythological name. But he says he found these manuscripts and he translated from the Old Gaelic into English. And that's what these books, they are English poems, long narrative, heroic poems, in the style of Homer. And they're actually quite well written and quite good. But Macpherson never produced the goods to show that he'd actually got the original documents. He was pushed and pushed and pushed. Dr. Johnson said, produce these documents, and if you don't, you're a cheat and a liar. Macpherson didn't like that and complained, and Dr. Johnson said, you can complain if you want, you're still a liar. So even the Highland Society of London gave Macpherson £1,000, a lot of money then, to actually come up with the goods, and he never did, because they almost certainly never existed. But it's an interesting episode in sort of Highland history, this sort of fictional work of Ossian. But I say the actual work itself is quite good. So Macpherson deserves some credit for writing a bit of imaginary history. As I said, if we go back to the Mackenzies, John Mackenzie of the Temple, who we're talking about, he didn't live at Tarradale. He owned Tarradale along with Rhinedown and so forth. But because he was an absent owner, he would rent Tarradale out from time to time. And one of the people he rented Tarradale to in the 1770s was Francis Humberston Mackenzie, who was, the head of Clan Mackenzie. Here's him again in the role of the first Lord Seaforth, both painted by Thomas Lawrence, the famous Lawrence. If you're of any importance, you were painted by Sir Thomas Lawrence. So Bran Castle, where he normally lived, was being rebuilt. So Francis Mackenzie and his wife took a lease of Tarradale House for a year or two. So that's a bit of an association. But while they were there, their daughter Mary Mackenzie, later to become Lady Hood, was born. So it's just one of these great coincidences. She was born at Tarradale because she was quite a remarkable lady. One of my heroines is Lady Hood. Firstly, she was 6 feet tall, quite a formidable person. And she married Admiral Hood, so somebody Hood, and became Lady Hood. The sad thing was that she had 6 older brothers who all predeceased her. that had been forecast. And she would have become, if she'd been a man, she'd have become, the Earl of Seaforth. But unfortunately, that couldn't happen. But she apparently was as good as any laird and had a great following and was much liked. And when she died in 1862 at Tarradale Castle, she was buried at Fort Rose Cathedral. The procession of her funeral was something like 8 miles long. She was such an important person. Everyone turned out for funeral. So it's just one of these things. She was born in Tarradale House. Okay, back to John Mackenzie of the Temple. Here's him here. I said he was never married. He didn't have any legitimate heirs. I think he had a son by his housekeeper, but he had no legitimate heirs. So in terms of if he was to pass the property on, his nearest heir was his nephew, a man called Kenneth Murchison, son of his sister Margaret. But Kenneth Murchison had gone to India, as we'll see in a minute, and he was actually quite interested in buying Tarradale, not expecting to be left it really in the fullness of time. So in 1788, Kenneth Murchison comes into the story. So we had Mackenzies for the last couple of 100 years. Now we've switched to Murchison. Murchison becomes the owners of Tarradale. So what do we know about Kenneth Murchison? So he was born in 1751 in Ochtertyre on the west coast near Kyle of Lahalsh. He was the son of the factor of Ochtertyre. He wasn't a laird's son. So he didn't have any money or influence really behind them. So he had to make his own way in the big world. He studied medicine in Glasgow and Edinburgh, and then at Guy's Hospital in London, and gained a diploma and became a surgeon. But again, because he didn't have the right contacts, he couldn't get a job in Britain, a plum job. So he got a job as a ship surgeon on a ship to India and China. And on the way back, he jumped ship in Calcutta and see if he could find a job. He introduced himself to the East India Company, who were ruling India at the time. But because he wasn't a gentleman in their eyes in the way that they would normally expect a surgeon to be, they actually gave him a job. I suggested, go and do this job, surgeon to the Nawab of Lucknow. So he wasn't technically in the East India Service, but he was pretty well with them. He lived in their compound and did everything with the East India Company, but technically he was in the service of this Nawab. And the amazing thing is he seemed to earn colossal sums of money. And I've seen the documents behind this. I wrote a paper about this, possibly earning £14,000 a year then. We're talking £1 million. The Nawab was very wealthy, being, in India. All his poor Indian peasants were slaving away to pay their rents to him. And Murchison, in his own way, was milking the system. And he certainly had a huge amount of money because after a few years, he moved back to Calcutta and lived there and spent 2 years repatriating his money. I've seen all the letters and documents for it. He was sending bags of diamonds back via Copenhagen and bills of exchange. And the amazing thing is, of course, everything took a very long time. And when he sent the diamonds, he wanted to insure them. So he writes a letter to his insurers in London and said, can you insure a pack of diamonds I'm sending to London via Copenhagen? Of course, the letter took 6 months to get to London and 6 months to come back. Yes, we'll insure it. By which time he'd sent them anyway. But they did get there. They didn't get lost. But in 1785, he comes back to Britain, to England via the continent, with Mrs. Gow and 3 children. Now, Mrs. Gow is his mistress. She's married to somebody else, couldn't get divorced then. But Murchison befriends her and they have 3 children. So they all come back from India together. He buys Tarradale for £6,800 from John Mackenzie of the Temple and sets himself up as a Highland laird. But in addition to having, a mistress and 3 sons, he obviously needed a proper wife. So he married Barbara Mackenzie, the daughter of the laird of Fairburn House, not that far from Muirvoad, and had another 3 sons by her. So here's Dr. Kenneth Murchison. I said a self-made man, if ever there was one, started off not really very wealthy, trained to be a doctor, made his fortune in India, came back, bought a Highland estate, the real laird. And of course, a laird needs a picture. So he gets Henry Raeburn, the best artist in Scotland, to paint his portrait. Very nice picture, probably slightly flattering, but there we are. That's what you paint portraits for. And Murchison was very pleased with this. So he said to Raeburn, great, thank you. Could you paint a picture of my wife as well? My young wife, young Barbara. And Raeburn writes back and says, of course I will, but could you pay for your portrait first? These pictures were then delivered by boat from Edinburgh up the coast to Inverness and then transported into a smaller boat up to Beaulieu Firth to the pier at Tarradale House. And everything went that way because we've got the accounts of the pictures arriving, of coal being delivered, barrels of wine being delivered, all up the Beaulieu Firth. But anyway, Kenneth Murchison established himself as the laird of Tarradale. But when he bought the house, his uncle, John Mackenzie the Temple, was being slightly sneaky. I mean, Murchison said he would buy it, but John Mackenzie thought, well, if I actually advertise it for sale as well, and Murchison won't, trying to bring the price down because he'll feel there's a degree of pressure if someone else is interested. I don't think there was. But anyway, what's useful is the description of Tarradale in the papers in 1788, particularly this bit. The lands lie almost wholly unenclosed, except some extensive plantations of fir. They are capable of improvement. So that's very interesting. So the land is clearly in the old system. It's open field, run rig, rig and furrow, the old system, capable of improvement. So that's what Murchison was buying into, this estate, which had really been quite neglected. He commissioned a map of the estate done by David Aitken in 1788. You can't see the big one. It's need a bit more detail. So this is part of it. This is where Tarradale House is, and we can focus in on that progressively. Oops, we go back one. So here's the house drawn on the map. I'm sure that was a pretty accurate drawing of the house. Various buildings here are stable and farm buildings. We've been excavating there fairly recently and not actually finding them quite where we thought they were on the map. But anyway, this map is drawn up. You can see the ridge and furrow here, the rigs of the old system. Here's the house, and that survived till about 1870s before it was rebuilt to the one you see today. The map contains a list of all the tenants of the main farm. See these ones there, and we don't need to go into this in detail, but these are what are called ferm tunes, joint farms. You can see Bachlady in sundry tenants' possession, Balaclash in Donald Mackay and others' possession, and John Monroe's and others' possession. See, these are classic ferm tunes run by joint tenants, varying sizes, anything from 30 to 60 acres, 70 acres, but not very big, considering there were 4 or 5 families dependent on that farm. But that was the old system of the ferm tune. And on the map, that's where they were. That's the 10 or 11 farms mentioned on the 1788 map. This is Tarradale House here. Here's the home farm there, the Mains of Tarradale, and these various other farms. Now, only with 3 of these survive today. Most of them have just disappeared off the face of the earth, as small farms had to be amalgamated into bigger farms. But if you can imagine a system of open fields and tenants living in these individual farmhouses and working the fields. The one big change was the home farm just behind Tarradale House. Murchison decided, having a farmyard, which he had to drive through. The drive went right through the middle of the farmyard to get to his house. Was probably a bit, full of smells and yells. And he actually had it moved to a new site, completely new site then. So that's where Tarradale Mains Farm is today. And it was built as a model farm in the 1790s. There's a steading, modified by this big shed later, of course. But then little court in there, lovely listed dovecote over it. And adjacent to it, a farmhouse for the farm manager, or the person who took the lease of the Mains farm. Probably it was just this bit on the left-hand side, that's the original farmhouse, and then this great bit was added on in the 1870s. And there was a good reason for that. But in addition to the farmers, these big farms, well, when I say big, relatively big joint farms, there were smallholders as well who did various improvements, which are listed on the map. So we've got 3 sets of improvements from the moor, and we can look at these on the map. And these are the farms on there, smallholders improvements. Just in the outskirts of Muiravour, there are 4 smallholders taking in some land. Up on what was Mulbury Common, this green area, that was the common, the Boulder Clay area, there were 50 plus smallholders improvements. And these were people, actually squatters. These little houses, which are still there, if you go over the Mulbury Road, you'll see all these houses there. They were essentially squatters on the common, but they could be regularized and then start paying rent. The laird would say, ho, you can certainly improve this land, create a little farm across for yourself, but you'll have to start paying me rent. So that was quite a big intake of land there on the common in Mulbury. So taking in moorland and common land. And here, 11 tenants, small tenants down just behind. There's Tarradale Mains, the farm that moved from there to there, just in this, what's a bit of rough woodland today. And we've done a bit of work on that. So the map of 1788 shows that area in some detail. Here's the main road, this yellow bit, that's actually been added on later. And this red line is the boundary of Tarradale Mains Farm. And again, that was later put onto the map. That was all part of the regularization of the landscape. But in here, let's just actually go back. There are a number of cottages. They're difficult to see, but these little black bars are cottages, people's names, Duncan McKeever and Widow Glass and so forth. So there are 11 tenants in there living on tiny plots of land on this really very poor land. This is boulder clay. This isn't the fertile land that I mentioned earlier. And I'm pretty sure these were people squeezed out of other farms. I mean, this is marginal land times 10. And these people there, they had a really tough time, and they paid rent for the little plots, but they also paid in kind, eggs and poultry, and also by labor, so many days indentured labor a year on the estate. But the interesting, they completely disappeared. They moved off the face of the earth sometime around 1800, I think. I think in the end, they just decided it was too tough a life, and they emigrated to somewhere and left very little behind. We excavated some of the houses, and you can see the outline of the houses there. We're also just finding the stone foundations, but I'm pretty sure there was no more stone above that height. These would have continued up with turf. There would have been turf buildings, very simple buildings, thatched roofs. Here's one actually built into the bank. It's only got a wall along the front and sides and a bank at the back. And we excavated down that, we found the clay floor. But we found hardly any artifacts, one or two little bits of pottery, a halfpenny, one or two bits of metal. And that was it. These were poor people. There's just no doubt of that. You see that from the artifacts they've left behind. Okay, so what happened to old Kenneth? Well, young Kenneth Murchison. Poor man died young. He died in 1796 when he was only 43, 45. Don't know what he died of, possibly cancer, but possibly syphilis. I mean, though he was a doctor, he obviously enjoyed himself in India. He was treating himself with mercury. And he thought that climate at Tarradale wasn't very good. And he took a house in Somerset, and lived there. And from there, he went to Bath to take the waters. And while he was doing that, he died in Bath. And he's buried here in Bathampton Church, which is just on the outskirts of Bath. Everybody knows that here. There will know Bathampton Church, charming little church. He's in a box grave in the churchyard along with his wife and his wife's brother, actually. But inside the church, in the base of the tower, is this memorial. Near the spot are deposited the remains of Kenneth Murchison of Tarradale, who departed this life in May 1796 at Bathampton. This humble tribute to the memory of a revered father is erected by an attached son. So who is this attached son that put this memorial up some years later? Well, it's this chap. It's Kenneth Murchison's second son. He had three sons, Alexander, Roderick, and Kenneth. Unfortunately, Alexander died when he was only 3 or 4 years old. He died of smallpox. So the second son, Roderick, became the heir to his father's estate. Roderick was only 4 years old when his father died. His mother, Barbara Mackenzie, remarried, and she then had a new family with her second husband. Roderick was sent off to boarding school in Durham and eventually went into the army. But he also became a very famous geologist, slightly unexpectedly. He was living a life of leisure. His wife was very wealthy. And she said, you need to do something with your life. Why don't you take up geology? Which he did in a major way. And within a few years, he was a major geologist, fellow of the Royal Society, became head of the Institute of Geological Sciences, president of the Royal Geographical Society. So a man who climbed very rapidly in Victorian society, a very important figure in the history of geology and geography. And though most people have never heard of him today, in a funny way you have. If you've heard of Murchison oil rig out in the North Sea, it's named after him. Murchison Falls in East Africa, Murchison crater on the moon. There's a Murchison glacier in, I think, New Zealand. So, his name does survive, though most people have forgotten about him. Many of his theories of geological theories, particularly in the Highlands of Scotland, have been superseded, but that's how science works. Okay, so Murchison, he inherits the estate from his father at age only 4. It is run by a factor for some years until he reaches his majority, and then it's up to him to decide what he does with it. He married quite young. He married Charlotte Huguenin, a wealthy lady from Hampshire. And well, it is true that he brought her up to Scotland, to Tarradale, to show her his Highland home. And one rather thinks that she probably said, well, I'm not living there. I tell you that now. I'm going to stay in Hampshire. So he decided he would sell it. Though people said, no matter how much money you got for it, having a Highland estate was worth more than the money in the bank. But anyway, he did sell it. And he sold it to neighbouring family, the Baileys, Evan Bailey of Dochford just on the side of Loch Ness. The Baileys were a very wealthy family from Bristol, where there were bankers and merchants. And they also had a house at Dochford, and Evan Bailey, he bought Tarradale from Roderick Murchison. And the family did live there, and for some time as one of their houses. They didn't necessarily live in Tarradale all the time, but we know they were there some of the time. And it passed through various other Bailey families, as you can see here. But in about 1838, Hugh Duncan Bailey, owning Tarradale, purchased the neighbouring estate of Redcastle. And they moved there, so they didn't need Tarradale anymore because they moved the family's Highland residence to Redcastle. Now, this is a rather fine picture of Redcastle. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite look like that anymore. It may not be quite as bad as that today. I've not seen it recently, but the roof was taken off by the late Lord Burton to avoid paying rates. And that's, the end of any building if you take the roof off. So that was a bit of a sad story. But, there still is a house on the estate. The Baileys still own that area. So what happens to Tarradale House? Because, the Baileys are no longer needed. They've got the castle at Redcastle. So if we look at the censuses just after that, 1838, they moved out. So 1841 census, we've got the Grieve living in the house. Though there is some confusion between Tarradale House and Tarradale Mains Farm. The census numerator was not very clear there. But James Robertson the Grieve was the man in charge of the farm after the Baileys moved out. But we know in 1861, Alexander Thompson was the farmer. He took the lease of the Mains Farm, though sadly he died in office a few years later. And then we get Joseph Chalmers, the farm manager, living in Tarradale House. But between 1871 and 1881, something clearly happens, because it's suddenly taken by John Hope Mackenzie, formerly the proprietor of a coffee estate, so he's not a farmer. The house was actually, Tarradale House was rebuilt in 1875 between these two dates by the Baileys. So I say they didn't need it anymore. So they rebuilt it to pretty well what you see today and rented it out. So one of the tenants was John Hope Mackenzie and his wife. And John Hope Mackenzie had been, a coffee estate somewhere and came back with his money and rented Tarradale for a good reason. Remember, when the Earl of Seaforth died with no male heirs and Lady Hood couldn't inherit the title, the head of Clan Mackenzie was vacant, if you want. And there were various contenders, and John Hope Mackenzie was one of the contenders. And he thought if he moved actually to nearby into Russia, he would strengthen his hand, though it wasn't strong enough. He didn't get it. So he was a tenant for a few years. And then 1891, tenant is the minister from next door, from Killernan. The manse is being rebuilt, so he rents Tarradale for a bit. But in 1901, we get a change. There's a lady called Amy Yule suddenly appears on the scene. And she had rented Tarradale for a few years, but about 1900, she was able to buy it from the Bailey family. So she bought Tarradale. She was still there in 1911, but she died in 1916. So by 1921 census, there's just a housekeeper living there. So the house has gone through various vicissitudes by then. But anyway, let's look and see who this lady Amy Yule was. Now, I could say a great deal about Amy Yule. I do a whole lecture on Amy Yule. Very interesting lady, mad as a coot, very clever, spoke several languages, wrote several books. She was related to the Murchisons. If you remember, Dr. Kenneth Murchison had his mistress, Martha Gow, and 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, Frances. Well, the daughter Frances married Martin White, who became Major General White, and they had a large family, 9 children, one of whom was Anna Maria, who married Sir Henry Yule, another man involved in Indian service, and their only daughter was Amy Yule. Amy Yule, somewhat oddly for a woman, was very interested in geology. From age 15, people gave her geology books as presents. And so she was very keen on her great uncle, Kenneth Murchison. I don't know if she ever met him, because she would only have been about quite a young woman when he died. But because she was so obsessed by the fact that her great uncle was this famous geologist, she wanted to buy Tarradale House. So she managed to persuade the Bailey family to sell her Tarradale House. So, but they sold, as I said, just the house and the policies. The whole of the rest of the estate stayed with the Baileys and still is in the ownership of the Bailey family. So Amy Yule sets to do all sorts of interesting things to Tarradale House. She particularly extends, she adds this great wing, a library wing on here. She builds the walled garden and various other bits and pieces, a lovely pavilion in the garden there. So she sets about making the place into a more modern house. That's the view from the back, and there's the back of the main house, but she adds on this great block. This is a reading room, a library reading room with a tower. And this is another study she built on there, and then built this lovely walled garden. I planted the trees, not her. They're 10 times the size of that now. And she built the library. And I'm sitting there right now on that chair talking to you. It's slightly chaotic in there, but this is my working office. And you're only seeing half the reading room, and there's another 2 floors through there. So it was an extensive library. So why did she keen to build such a big library? Well, the reason for that is she decided, as she had no heir, she was never married, no children, only child, no close relations, that she would leave the house as a place of rest and refreshment for poor scholars. And this is all laid out in great detail in her will. She was very influenced by John Ruskin, and she knew John Ruskin. John Ruskin was a friend of her parents, and she had met John Ruskin in England. She actually went to a school that John Ruskin was a trustee of, and she met him in Geneva, and she met him in Sicily when her parents were living there. And John Ruskin was a pioneer of the Working Man's College in Sheffield. So I think Amy Yule was trying to emulate that. She wanted this to become a college, a place where poor scholars, particularly people who'd missed out on formal education, poor people who didn't get the opportunity then, to come to the Tarradale, read in the library with a fantastic collection of books covering every subject under the sun, walk around the grounds, walk along the firth, observe wildlife, go bird watching, go to church on Sunday was a stipulation. So this was her whole idea, a wonderful sort of concept. It just didn't work, unfortunately, because these poor people, the people she wanted to come, couldn't afford to come. It cost £1 a week to stay there. Okay, it was full board. You were looked after very well. But £1 a week, I mean, a working man might be only earning £1 a week, at best £2 a week. I mean, they did drop the weekly fee to 10 shillings, but even that was too much. So it just did not work in the way it was meant to. People did come, but they were not poor scholars. The people that came were people coming for a jolly good time in their sports cars and golf clubs in the back. And that got a bit of a reputation for that, which is all a bit sad. But anyway, it stuttered through the Second World War and into the 1950s. And, they ran out of money. Her endowment, with inflation, post-war inflation, wasn't worth enough. The house had been badly maintained. There was no electricity in it. They were going to knock it down at one point. Eventually, it was referred to the Scottish Education Department, who didn't know what to do with it either, but eventually persuaded Aberdeen University to take it over. And they did so in 1959. They took it over to make it into a field centre. So it suddenly became a place where students, both university students, but also adult students from elsewhere could come. And they could accommodate it with between 30 and 40 students, fairly, bunk beds and things, but they could get them in. And with university, it was reasonably successful. And I went there several times as a student on courses on geography and geology and archaeology. I also went there several times on work parties because all the maintenance was done by by university students. In fact, even the wiring of the house, the initial wiring of the house was done by university students, not geography students, but by engineering, electrical engineering students. So this was a nice task for them to wire this house for the first time, and they did that. When they connected to the mains, bang, and apparently that's why the Black Isle is called the Black Isle. The whole of the Black Isle went dark. So the story goes. But anyway, the university ran it for 40 years, but by 2003, field centres were going out of fashion. Students were no longer the 18 to 21 cohort that I was when I was there. Students are often older, they're married, they have jobs. That's the only way they can survive. They couldn't take a week or 2 weeks off and come here and pay to study here and go on field trips. So the university decided to get rid of it in 2003, and I bought it. As I said, knew the house well from having stayed there previously. I should say I and my late wife bought it. A place of rest and refreshment for poor scholars was Amy Yule's view. Well, I'll qualify as the poor scholar. I'm not sure if I'll get much rest and probably some refreshment. But also she added, including those no longer young. Thank you very much. Somebody still there?
Yes, sorry, I was having trouble unmuting myself. Well, thank you so much, Eric. Honestly, the amount of history that you've managed to sort of elucidate over the years is quite incredible. There can't be many houses with such a comprehensive understanding of the whole history of the place, you know, right from the Mesolithic up to the present day, you know, quite incredible. I promised it was all going to be fascinating, and I hope everybody found that it was.
Alistair, you don't have your camera on.
Right, okay. Well, that's probably a good thing for all of you, really. For some reason, my camera makes me...
I'll take my glasses off, then you won't know who's who.
Okay, that's good. So I'm not sure if we've got any questions, but I've got one to start us off. As you've said, you knew the house before you bought it and moved there, but did you have how much of an idea of its history did you have before you got there and started digging, almost literally, well, and literally digging into it all?
Well, really very little. I mean, the university had produced a little pamphlet on the history of the house, but it wasn't very good. It was done by a former student, and they'd just identified some of the main tenants and wrote a bit about them. But so I worked on that. But when I used to come on field trips and so forth, I mean, we weren't particularly interested in the history of the house. It was just a good place to stay at, you know, lots of young people having a high old time on a field course. So it was really after I came here, and well, two sides. The archaeological side, just by walking around the fields, I realized there's a lot of archaeological heritage. But also when I started looking into the documentary sources, going through the Register of the Great Seal, you know, I mean, rather tedious, but it produces the goods in the end of the day. So, you know, a lot of work, but you know, if you dig deeply enough, then you will get the information and stick it together and make a story out of it.
Yes, well, and it's a fantastic story. I mean, so many interesting people associated with the place, and you know, one of the highlights for me is the wee piece of horse, you know, decoration for the medieval horse. It's just being able to tie that to a specific individual way back then is just absolutely great.
But also to not just to tie it to an individual, but they know that the Verdens were, you know, involved in the independence. So it all meshed in nicely.
It all fits together brilliantly. So we have a question from Jules Christie now. You mentioned a pier. Where was it, and what sort of was it a solid structure? What sort of thing was it? I guess we may not know either of those.
Well, Jules Christie, who I can't see on the screen, but Jules, if anyone knows where the pier is, the pier is just below Tarradale House, and we don't know what the original pier was. The pier that we see today, which is built of sandstone below Tarradale House, was constructed probably in the 1800s to allow the shipment of sandstone from Tarradale Quarry. There was a quarry in the grounds a bit further away from the house, and sandstone was taken by cart down to the pier to be shipped out. So that was the main reason for the pier we see today. But almost certainly there were predecessors that probably timber-built piers, I would think, but on the same position as a current pier.
Great, thanks, Eric. Thank you.
Well, I wasn't aware that there was one, so that's interesting in itself.
It's
So-
very overgrown, but I mean,
So-
at low tide, it's very, very clear.
All right.
Eric,
Yes, Graham.
I've often wondered why, certainly when I was researching Redcastle, how there were very few signs of the Picts. And it was in fact, it was almost because people felt that they had to be there that they ever got a mention. You know, no significant Pictish relic has been found. I think I'm right in saying in Redcastle and Tarradale, which seems very strange given the location with the on the Bewley Firth and so much easier to get boats in and so on. And surely the Picts would have known that. And have you ever thought why?
Well, I think the Picts were there. There's no doubt about that. The point is the Picts can be a bit elusive. If they left a symbol stone, if they had a carved stone somewhere, then that's obvious. There aren't any Pictish symbol stones around Tarradale. There may never have been any. They were made for specific purposes. But the Picts were definitely there. Their houses are pretty insubstantial. You very rarely find a Pictish house, particularly in an area of farmland they're ploughed to pieces. But what we do find are their graves. So the big Barrow Cemetery, just 400 meters from Tarradale House, that we excavated in 2019. As I said, we have Bronze Age graves, Iron Age graves, and a big Pictish cemetery. We have these circular and square graves, which are classically Pictish. And we only found one skeleton because the soil is so acidic, everything had rotted. But we were able to date the skeleton, I think it was to 577 AD. Well, that's pretty Pictish date. So, and as I said, these barrows, one of the square barrows is the largest square barrow in Scotland. That was something important. I mean, we could almost go as far as say a Pictish king lived at Tarradale. So the Picts were there. It's just they're rather hidden in the landscape. So I hope that answers your question.
I've asked a few farmers if they can drop their plough in a bit more deeply and see what they come up with, but they don't seem very interested in doing that. But anyway, it's teased me as to why they were so obviously there, and but we're not finding anything, or well, very little sign.
We're finding very little material culture. We're not finding objects that you can say is definitely Pictish. And I don't know the reason for that. If there were metal objects do rust and completely disappear. But Picts often had high quality stuff, as we know from elsewhere. They had silver and gold things, but we found none of them at Tarradale. None of the graves at Tarradale ever used any grave goods. But the date we got for the Pictish skeleton and also these square barrows, I mean, these are absolutely characteristic of the Picts. So the Picts were definitely there.
Yeah, thanks.
So Fran Tilbrook asks a very interesting question, which I sort of noticed in passing, but didn't latch onto. So I think relating to 1595 date, what actually are multures?
Well, good question. What's to do with the mill? The multures are the rent you paid when you took your corn to be ground at the mill. A percentage of it, the multure, had to be given to the laird for the pleasure of grinding your corn at his mill. So there was a tax on milling, if you want. Yeah.
All right.
It's pronounced, I know it's spelled multures, apparently it's pronounced mooters in Scots. But that's what it was. It was your payment for having your corn ground at the mill.
All right. Very good. So Alison, who possibly has left us, sends her thanks for all the interesting information, and they will continue to look out for artifacts at Spittal Shore.
Indeed. Well, I hope she does. Yes.
Well, it'd be good to find something, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Yes,
So
Spittal Shore, this lady Alison mentioned, Spittal Shore is very interesting, of the name Spittal, which
mhm,
probably is an abbreviation of hospital. Now,
yes.
medieval times, hospital wasn't what we would think of a hospital. A hospital was more of an overnight stopping place, like a hostel rather than a hospital.
Mhm.
But Spittal Shore has this name, and Graham knows more about it than I do. But there is some suggestion there was a medieval hostel there for people traveling along the main road, because that was the main road in the past from, round the Bewley Firth and all the way to Cromarty. So many important people would have gone along there.
Right. And we've got
Yeah,
there's a large wood, isn't there? Spittal Wood,
Spittal Wood just above it, yeah.
where Kate McCulloch and
Yeah.
um,
On the road, we traced the road through there.
that's right. Yeah. Yes.
I think Graham's trying to say something. Graham, are you going to
Yes.
I was in the Inverness Field Club back in, I think it was about 1880, maybe 90, around about that time, I think, visited the hospital, which is on Gargison farmland. And there was still a considerable part of the building, including a round window, and still on one of the standing gables. The extraordinary thing is that nobody these days seems to even know exactly where it was. There's no evidence of it. There are piles of stones, but then any farm's got a pile of stones. So, and so, and I remember talking at one time with I think it was Michael. His surname's gone from me. Martin, sorry. And talking to him, and he says the pile of stones that's recorded, I think in Canmore, actually was not where it was.
Yeah.
And he promised to take me to see it, and I'm still haven't taken him up on that.
I mean, I went looking for it once. I walked all over the area, but I could see nothing that you could identify as a medieval building. But it's interesting it's there. I mean, another part of the medieval landscape, yeah.
Well, yes, but it was there in Victorian times.
Yeah, yeah.
Late Victorian. And yet there's no pictures of it. It's an oddity.
Good. So somebody has said, and this may be Fran again, for information, I think Redcastle is actually still owned by James Bailey, grandson of the late Lord Burton of Dochford.
I think that's correct, yeah.
Yes, yes, yeah. Still the Baileys of Dochford, anyway, yes. Yeah.
They're an interesting mob. I don't know much about them, but the sort of family graveyard at Dochford is full of some interesting monuments.
Yeah, all the great and the good buried there.
Yeah. Well, I think we may have run out of questions. So it remains to thank you very much indeed, Eric, for all that fascinating information. I'm very glad that you agreed to us recording this, because I think it's going to repay returning to in future to follow up on all those interesting documentary references and remind ourselves of all these different people who were involved. So yeah, a fascinating evening. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.